Retro Studios were undoubtedly given some huge shoes to fill when it came to making the next title in the Metroid franchise. Super Metroid, released a good 8 years prior, is one of the most highly acclaimed games of all time, yet its successor was given to a then unknown Texan development team who seemed to be making something that didn't resemble Metroid at all. This all comes down to the key principles of Metroid, which are not controls nor perspective, but structure and progression. Super is often praised for its non-linearity, yet despite some neat sequence-breaking tricks, most of which I can't properly pull off, by and large there is clearly an intended path for the player to follow. The game is essentially linear, but disguises itself as such, asking players to navigate a labyrinth and inevitably getting lost in the process. The meat of Super is item-based progression, becoming so familiar with an area that you can recall rooms you were previously unable to access, and then revisiting them with an item that lets you pass or grab some goodies. Because of this backtracking, how the maps are interconnected is essential. Not counting the starters and desserts for the games, which are very distinct from the main course, the titles are made up of 4 or 5 main areas. If you placed all of these in a straight line, to get a power up from the first level you'd have to retrace your steps all the way back just to get it. To streamline this, areas should have more than one entry point. The very vertical nature of Super Metroid allows Criteria, for example, to have 4 whole elevator shafts connecting it to other maps. However, looking at it now, it is somewhat limited. 3 of these elevators connect it to Brinstar, and while they may link it to radically different sections of one of the more varied maps, that's still only one portion of a large world. Its other elevator also connects to Meridia, an area which, in my experience, you won't find yourself going back to a whole lot. This seems like particularly wasted potential, as North Air only has 1 entry point. In all fairness, it is at the intersection of both Brinstar and Meridia, but it still places the player at only one end of the map, which can make getting all the way down here a little tedious. By contrast, Metroid Prime's Tallon Overworld, arguably the equivalent of Super's Criteria, has 5 lifts, 3 leading to the Chozo Ruins, 1 to Magmoor Caverns, and 1 to the Phazon Mines. None of the rest only have 1 entry point either, which makes accessing different sections of the map a bit easier, especially ones like Magmoor Caverns, which are largely a straight line. Prime as a whole seems more interconnected than Super. There may be some exceptions. Phendrana drifts can bizarrely only be accessed both ways by going through Magmoor Caverns. Tallon Overworld has 2 far apart elevators that connect to basically the same room in the Chozo Ruins, but on the whole, Prime is much more centered on frequent trips back and forth between areas. Super Metroid, on the other hand, is more concentrated. Criteria, Brinstar, and North Air all exhibit similar hub structures with several rooms leading off 1 or 2 key areas. It's also more concentrated in how there are several points of no return, which can be a good or bad thing. For example, I spent far too long trying to traverse this nightmarish quicksand sequence because I didn't know how to circumvent this small metal gate. There's actually a hidden passage I should have noticed. However, this can help keep the player focused on their new objectives, such as this iconic shaft that basically locks players in North Air until they acquire the ice beam key to escaping. By comparison, a similar shaft into Magmoor Caverns doesn't act as a point of no return at all. While it may not be tempting to head back up the series of moving platforms, it is possible. While Super allows you to largely get intimate with each map before heading on, there are often times where you can't fully explore and the inability to go back can be frustrating. You dip your toe in arguably the 3 most important areas one after another, and then upon getting the ice beam can make your way up this shaft out of North Air, home of the Firefish Fingers. This all leads into your re-emergence on Criteria. Here the game really opens up. You're now back at the starting point, only you have a plethora of new abilities to use. The conventional action to take here is going back through the previous areas. With your newfound abilities, you can explore these places more fully than before. The hub setup also allows you to move quickly through all of these areas, as you can ignore the superfluous rooms held for progress unlockers before. It's a big moment. The game has essentially come full circle at this point, and the music reflects that, shifting triumphantly into Samus's theme. Metroid Prime, as noted, follows a somewhat different structure. There's not as concrete a full circle early on, as you'll be going back and forth between areas more often, but there are still similar moments. As you progress through Tallon 4, the Tallon Overworld is rarely necessary for much, only appearing in fleeting moments between the other areas which see a lot more action. On your second visit, it's possible to get to this area out of reach at the start of the game. These space pirates are knocking around before your first formal introduction to them, and they fly away at first sight. This gives the area an air of mystery. The map says it's the crashed frigate from the opening of the game, but you can't reach it. Just as you thought you were going to do some more exploring of this place with your new power-ups, you're stopped in your tracks. After progressing a fair bit more in the Phendrana drifts and Chozo Ruins, you end up being able to access this lift, which sets you right up here. The power dynamic has now shifted and you're on top. The music of this area has also shifted from your last time here after the Thardas battle, cementing this change in power dynamic. Finally, you can re-explore that ship you blew up at the very start of this adventure, only you still can't fully traverse this as you need yet another item, the gravity suit. This constant blue balling helps continuously remind players of this sunken ship, keeping it at the back of your mind. It works as this big, important roadblock between the first area you set foot in and the depths of the Phazon Mines, the space pirate base of operations. Moments like this are important because the whole game revolves around returning to previously inaccessible areas with the tools to progress. You need these rooms to have some sort of memorable element that cements them in your mind. Super has a fantastic example of this with the grapple beam. Before unjustly walking into Crocomyre's home and drowning the guy in acid, you're likely to come across some chasms that you can't make your way across. The frustration at not being able to make your way over a slightly longer jump cements this in the little grapple beam points in your mind. Then, right after you pick up the grapple beam, you find yourself in this room with those same hooks on the ceiling and a really similar looking staircase. This isn't about teaching you how to use the grapple beam, but more so subtly reminding you to revisit other places by echoing their design. Areas cementing themselves in your memory are usually more isolated incidents throughout the series. Super Metroid has this moment of frustration with the closing gates that are impassable without the speed booster, and Prime has stuff like this out-of-place morphball corridor with deadly Phazon that will harm you without the Phazon suit. But a key change was made from Super to Prime, and it was perhaps a necessary one. Super's grid-like map works on a 2D plane but can't translate well to 3D, so Prime goes for a rotatable 3D mesh. There was also ambiguity in Super's incomplete map. It wouldn't tell you where doors were, and for rooms not fully explored, it wouldn't display the whole room, rather only the square you'd stepped foot in. This is completely the opposite of Prime's map, reflecting the more intricate shapes of its rooms with names and positions of doors to boot. Now this sounds really boring, maybe it is, but these map changes alter the way in which you move about the world a fair bit. Prime was actually the first in the series to have beam-dependent doors, and the fact that the map displays what kind of beam is needed for what door means that upon getting a new beam power-up, it can be easy for players to simply scour the map to find the right coloured doors to proceed. This map stuff isn't as bad as it sounds. It only applies to doors. You're not given a clear direction outside this if you actually play the game properly, which means turning off the hint system, and other roadblocks you may come across aren't marked for you on the map. It also just applies to rooms you're looking at already, so you still kinda need to know where you're going. But there is something to be said for how Super Metroid really has you drilling the layout of ZBs into your skull. It makes you feel more like you're getting to know its blueprints by heart. Each of these rooms having stronger identities thanks to the more organic structure and distinct purposes rather than simple boxy shapes makes it easier to tell what you're looking at on the map. This was probably necessary given Prime's added dimension and also slightly less funneled structure than Super Metroid. Constantly switching between areas could have made it a little difficult to recollect exactly what was where on each map if all you had to go on was a very vague blue and pink grid. Of course, this all works to serve the main goals of both games. Both games have a central elevator down to the final short area before the final boss and are set up in similar ways. Both use that concept earlier described to make this place memorable. Before moving on from criteria, there's this tempting door which precedes a desolate, silent, foggy hallway. This leads into a room with a very conspicuous ornate statue depicting this pterodactyl goober who you've already met. Prime has a similar out-of-place hallway accessible from the first time you set foot on Tallon with its own musical shift and very unusual looking statues. The way you go about these goals actually differs a bit though. Super's more concentrated structure directly ties these keys to the bosses, whereas in Prime they're collectibles you need to go out of your way to get. Outside of mad speedruns, bosses have to be killed anyway in order to acquire the necessary items to progress, so having them be the keys to the final area is almost arbitrary in all but a cool thematic sense. By contrast, all but the first Chozo artifact in Prime force you to go out of your way. This all comes back to structure. Super's loop around helps reaffirm the goal of the game by allowing players to witness their progress made after the first full circle. It helps reaffirm just how much left you have to explore. All you've done so far is kill a fat green dude who grew a few feet since the first game. You've still got all these ugly bozos to beat. Prime's key hunt gets a lot of complaints, but what it does do is force players to learn the whole map inside out. The change in map system also aids this, as the statues give hints for each one. Personally, I don't find many of the locations too offensive. The way the map names rooms allows you to find them quite easily, but you'll actually have to think about just what inside these rooms you have not yet experimented with. The only real offender is this bloody artifact in Phendrana. There is no reason for this wall to not have an indicator that it can be power bombed. Yeah, the hint implies you should be using the X-ray visor, but holy hell, I'm not making my way up a vertical tower with that thing strapped to my face. Regardless, with the way a lot of these are placed relatively near to elevator shafts and how interconnected the map is, it can take a relatively short amount of time to get a decent amount of these. Other than for Phendrana, which again only has entrances from Magmor caverns, you won't have to go too far out of your way to collect them all. The way the maps interconnect also means you can access most of the different areas if you realise you've forgotten particular artifacts in specific locations. I feel as if this alteration to the formula was a sensible one. It still keeps to those key themes we've discussed earlier, while adding to the concept of revisiting areas not fully explored. You can pick these up in any order, but you're likely to go on this hunt after receiving the Phazon suit and completing a full circle within the Phazon Mines. It is now firmly established that you have all you need to go on this one final treasure hunt. It's fitting that the precursor to the game's finale should act as a sort of send-off for the place you've come to know so well. What sells all this is how beautifully crafted these worlds are. Super for the time is just coated in sublime ambience, water dripping from the walls, a variety of alien plant life, and a timeless moody soundtrack. Prime really stepped things up in terms of giving rooms their own unique purpose within the Metroid universe, carrying their own names and histories behind them. The Chozo Ruins isn't just desert world, it's a ruin, a relic of a lost civilization with its own functions and technologies. Retro only got better at this stuff as time went on. Take a look at Prime 3 for some wonderful examples of immaculate and meticulously crafted environments that feel like genuine products of otherworldly beings. This final point is how Metroid hits the nail on the head compared to its contemporaries. These rich, detailed aesthetics are complementary to its back and forth structure. You're going to be seeing a lot of the same areas in Metroid. It's inherent in its nature. It's Metroid, you backtrack. Take a look at the original Metroid for an apt comparison. From navigating a repetitive series of confusing tunnels to conquering all four corners of fully realized exotic locales, the astounding work of the art teams pushes this series into a league of its own, turning these games into a cohesive whole that leaves a lasting impression. Super Metroid is a renowned classic, so of course there's bits and pieces of aesthetics that Retro nabbed. The intro on a desolate space station, a rainy, mossy landing, a fiery section with a remix of the Norfair theme, and a wrecked ship. But much more importantly, this core design of Super Metroid has been translated and adapted to fit this new style of play. Despite its initial backlash, Metroid Prime received huge acclaim and now sits alongside Super Metroid in critical and public reception. Rightfully so, because as we've seen, the superficial elements like a third-person perspective or a 2D plane don't make a game Metroid. Prime took what worked in Super and transformed it wonderfully into the third dimension. This is a series that's very near and dear to me, and while it's hard not to lament its painful death, I can't really complain if it's already given us two of the greatest games ever made. I'm not here to settle the debate on which is better. There's no point. These are both masterpieces. Classics still worth your time 14 or 22 years later.